All right, we're not going to waste any time today. We're getting right to it. Let's get down to business to defeat the Huns. Hello? Are you serious? You're telling me the Huns never invaded China? And that Mulan may or may not be a myth? Well, that really scraps most of my plans for this video here. I'm gonna have to figure something else out. Hey, run it. Darn it, Disney and your revisionist history. I love Mulan. It would have been so great to use here, but historically it just doesn't fit. Not just because of the Huns, so much of it is based on myth and legend, and while it does show us a good picture of Chinese culture, it doesn't necessarily have historical value. Earlier in Unit 1, we talked a little bit about ancient China, specifically the Qin Dynasty and the Zhou Dynasty, both of which were influential in creating Chinese culture as we know it and creating China as a modern state in comparison to many of the other civilizations around the world. But where we last left off, China was very disunified. It was very clan-based and divided based on different unities. In fact, this period at this time is known as the period of warring states. From about 256 BC to 221 BC, China would be engaged in a series of inter-civilization conflicts within its own borders. But out of that comes the first true great dynasty that unifies China, the Qin Dynasty. During the dynasty reign, the Qin had primarily one emperor. His name was Shi Huangdi, and he's one of the greatest rulers in all of Chinese history. Actually, great might not be the best word for it. It actually depends on your definition of great. Much like we talked about with Alexander. Remember, it depends on your worldview, but you can't underestimate the accomplishments that Shi Huangdi had while he reigned. Get this out there in the open first. Shi Huangdi was a militaristic leader. He used brutal force to unify China under its first empire, under the Qin. And it was effective because it did end this period of disunity, the period of warring states. And for the first time, China had one unified identity. And in order to make this vision a reality and to maintain control and maintain unity, Shi Huangdi turned to the policies of legalism, which we have discussed before. Remember that because humans are inherently evil, there's a belief that strict laws and punishments are necessary to keep the peace. And that's exactly what Shi Huangdi did. He tried to keep the peace through strict laws, and he actually demoted many of the old lords and leaders of China and made them into peasants. And by using a strict system of taxation, he allowed China to have a constant flow of income, again, unifying all of China's resources together. And in order to ensure that China wasn't just a collection of small kingdoms with some similarities, he created a number of different changes that brought unity to China, like a standard system of weights and measurements, or a common system of coinage that was universal in all of China. But the most important thing about Shi Huangdi is this policy of legalism and almost the idea of paranoia that seemed to follow him. He dealt with people who opposed him very harshly. He would torture and kill anyone who was adverse to what he believed. In fact, those who clung to the old ideas of Confucianism and even Taoism in China were often met with persecution and death because they had ideas that were against that which Shi Huangdi had created within China, these legalist philosophies. And therein lies one of the biggest tragedies of Qin China. Believing that an increase in education or a return to Confucian thought would stir up revolution and be a threat to his throne, Shi Huangdi had thousands of books, especially Confucian ones, burned. Like many other figures in history, Shi Huangdi was scared of what he didn't understand or what he didn't assume to be true. And in the name of safety and security, he had education essentially destroyed. It sets China back a little bit. But then again, Shi Huangdi was all about security. You can see that with his major famous achievement. The Great Wall of China was built to protect China from any invaders, from any influence from the outside world. It was meant to keep China independent, safe, and in control of its own culture. Well, the wall is not exactly contiguous. It doesn't necessarily continue or wrap around all of China. It is regionally based and protects different pockets of Chinese civilization. And much of it was already built before the Qin, but its completion during the Qin Dynasty showcases the power and wealth that the Qin and Shi Huangdi truly had. It's a lasting reminder of the unification and power of China in the ancient world. And despite all this security that the wall symbolizes, and despite the success of Shi Huangdi, he still was insecure. Deep down, he was scared, which might explain his constant pursuits of ways to protect himself. Most specifically, a fabled relic called the Elixir of Life, similar to myths like the Fountain of Youth or the Philosopher's Stone. The Elixir of Life was believed to be something that would make Shi Huangdi live forever, and he spent so much of his resources in pursuit of this. In fact, many historians believe that the reason he had so many of the books burned was he wanted his scientists and anyone who was educated to focus on making him live forever. But alas, the elixir was never found. In fact, legend says that one of the parties that he sent out in search of it arrived in Japan. And when they didn't find the elixir, out of fear of what Shi Huangdi would do to them when they returned, they just stayed in Japan and started Japanese civilization. Probably a legend, but an interesting thought. Shi Huangdi truly thought his empire would last forever, and he thought that he would rule it forever. But like all people, death came to Shi Huangdi. And yet, even in death, he tried to find ways to control China forever. In his massive tomb, Shi Huangdi had a massive army of terracotta soldiers created, and it was believed that these soldiers would have the ability to come to life in order to not only protect his tomb, but bring order and Qin Dynasty back to China. It's yet another symbol of the wealth and power of the Qin Dynasty. And while the Qin Dynasty didn't last long, its legacy survives through the Great Wall and this massive army in a tomb. It's also a major tourist attraction. In fact, I had a student who went and visited the army in the tomb and brought back a little terracotta soldier. It's an exact replica of one of them and is also made out of terracotta. Yeah, it's a little bit of a flex, sorry. After Shi Huangdi's death, however, the Qin Dynasty rapidly declines and is quickly replaced. In fact, it collapses because the people of China didn't really identify with the goals and the practices of Qin Dynasty. They felt that it didn't necessarily represent China as a whole. Liu Bong, an illiterate peasant, was able to unite an army around him, and he eventually seized control of China. He cited the traditional Chinese belief in the mandate of heaven, or that the gods selected rulers, and through that dynastic cycle, empires would rise and fall. And it's this return to old Chinese beliefs that gains a following for Liu Bong. As emperor, he took on the name Gao Zu, and if he had a campaign slogan, it would have been something like this: "Make China Chinese again." He specifically wanted to return not only to old Chinese traditions, but old beliefs too, specifically Confucianism. Confucianism isn't a religion, but it is a philosophy and way of life, and it deals with very strict morality as well as beliefs in service to your family and service to the state. The thought was re-embracing these ideas would actually make China more united than it was under legalism, and definitely more. This new dynasty would last from about 206 BC all the way to 220 AD. It's a contemporary of the Roman Empire known as the Han Dynasty, and it's truly China's first golden age. Gao Zu surrounded himself with Confucian scholars. He made Confucianism a part of Chinese society once again, and with that, the Han Dynasty begins to flourish. While Gao Zu is credited with starting the Han Dynasty, he's nowhere near as famous or as beloved in history as one of his predecessors, arguably the greatest ruler in all of Chinese history. And now introducing your leader, your emperor, the number one leader of the Han Dynasty, and number one in your heart, the one, the only, Emperor Wudi. Wudi is what made the Han Dynasty a golden age for China. Not only did he unite China more so through Confucianism, but he also expanded it to arguably its height. It was roughly about the size of the United States. He also revolutionized the Chinese economy, putting government monopolies on commodities like salt and iron. And while the government had control, they also had the control to manipulate the economy and make sure it was always producing. It's also during the reign of Wudi that China creates one of the greatest trade routes of all time, the Silk Road, which stretched all the way to what would be the Roman Empire. With it, China became rich, trading their exotic materials, specifically silk and porcelain, with countries further to the west. So under Wudi, not only did China grow and expand, it also became financially a power. The Han Dynasty flourished unlike any other Chinese dynasty had. But most importantly, Wudi created unity in China through a return to Confucianism. By getting back to these values, specifically the idea of filial piety, respect for parents above all else, China was way more moral than it was under the Qin, and it was also more connected. It's also during the Han Dynasty that they returned to the practice of civil service. Confucius had believed that everybody had a role to play within society, and more specifically, specific people should be chosen to work for the good of government and should be paid for it. But in the Han Dynasty, they take this a step further, creating a system of civil service exams in which applicants would have to pass a series of tests to achieve their position by merit. It created a very effective governing system, one that was fair and equal, yet allowed for participation. Unfortunately, over time, much like the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty became too large to defend itself, and it didn't have an adequate military. It faced severe famine as well as some plagues, and it relied too much on taxation. And because of that, it fell. Yet it left behind a standard for what China could be when it was unified. It's during the Han Dynasty that China pioneers paper, gunpowder, and numerous advances in art and medicine. Not only did China become truly itself again, it flourished and it developed on a scale that is incomparable to a lot of these contemporary classical states. And so once again, the Qin and the Han Dynasty are a reflection of the cyclical nature of history. History has its ups and it has its downs. And that's true for societies and civilizations around the world, and China is just another example of that. More specifically, the Han Dynasty has created a foundation for Chinese civilization, that from here, it can only grow. And it will continue to do so. China, because of the Great Wall, because of its geography, and because of its nature and worldview, has remained relatively secluded from the rest of the world. That's going to change relatively soon. And what will happen when the Chinese worldview clashes with others from around the world? Well, that's a story for another day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.